Hello, everyone. This is Eva Norlick-Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Facebook Live talk with renowned yoga teacher T.S. Little, founder of Prajna Yoga. T.S. is a widely loved teacher who brings an incredibly varied background to his work as a yoga teacher. He is deeply steeped in both Iyengar yoga and Ashtanga yoga traditions, and in addition, T.S. is a long-term student of Tibetan Buddhism and Vipassana meditation, and he is also a licensed body worker with in-depth training in cranial sacred therapy. He is particularly known for his deep philosophical approach to the practice and teaching of yoga asana. And he really, T.S., I believe one of the hallmarks of your teaching is your ability to integrate ancient yogic wisdom with practical knowledge from Western anatomy and science. T.S. lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his wife, Surya, and he is the author of 3 books, including his most recent book, Yoga of the Subtle Body. T.S., welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Eva. It's a joy to be with you.
So, it seems like modern yoga is increasingly oriented around fitness, which makes a lot of sense because yoga offers a lot of fitness benefits and a lot of health benefits. And there is less and less integration of yoga philosophy in modern yoga classes. Yet one of the hallmarks of your teaching is your deep integration of classical asana practice with ancient yogic philosophy and wisdom. So with the growing emphasis on fitness in modern yoga, are we missing out on some of potentially the most valuable aspects of the ancient yogic teaching?
Well, it's a good question. It's possible that if one gets preoccupied with the body in their movements and their physical training, that one becomes kind of attached to how they look and how flexible they are, and whether they can do handstand in the middle of the room. And so one's whole self-identity can get wrapped up in the physical asanas, especially when there are mirrors in the room and there's lots of comparing or competing. So much of yoga, of course, is working with the identity of who am I? And the inquiry around that is so important.
Yeah. I think, one of the reasons many yoga teachers hesitate to bring in yoga philosophy, yoga wisdom is, in a sense, out of respect for students who don't necessarily want yoga to be a spiritual practice, right? Which is understandable, and people really shouldn't have to subscribe to something they don't necessarily, they're not interested in. But might we say that there is an aspect where that ancient yogic wisdom and the approach to the sacred might really be rooted in some very real anatomical realities of the body?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in some ways, perhaps now more than ever, it's important that people connect to the sacred interior of their body, mind, and especially in the light of the despair and the rise of suicide and opioid addiction, is that there's a lot of darkness in the world. And so there's more calling, I think, to have a direct connection and yoking to what people can call spirit, or they can call the body of light, or the Buddha nature. The language around how one refers to it is not all that important, but maybe what's most important is the inner connection of really coming home to one's own resource, and then having great appreciation and altruistic motivation for the support of others. And really that sense, kindness or generosity, metta, sympathetic awareness lies right at the heart of our teaching. But maybe to answer your question, I think language is important on the other hand, because the wisdom teachings are hard to share. And sometimes in the yoga classroom, they can sound really kind of fluffy, like, cotton candy, or like someone's reading from the back of a Special K cereal box, like spiritual teabag, ism. And it takes time to really seep into these teachings enough that a teacher can allow them to come through their pores and share it. But the language is important, and I use a lot the language around potency rather than necessarily God or Shiva or Buddha or Ganesha or, the deities that are 10,000 miles away. But when we talk about inner potency, which is a language that I in part borrow from osteopathic medicine and craniosacral work, is that potency is in the spine, it's throughout the body, and it can be felt, and it can be animated and yoked to, and it's all powerful. So as the Tibetan teachings always say, we have this precious human existence with this life force, and to what extent can we harness it and yoke to it?
So then the osteopaths talked about inner potency. They talked about what the ancient yogis referred to as prana, or vital essence, vital energy.
I think so, yeah. And when we are connected to our vital energy, I think that's when we're really comfortable in our skin and we have great vitality. We're open to others, people of difference, and the changing world around us. We have a capacity to be more adaptable and open. So that potency gives us a means to not only feel good inside, but to all realize the kind of fundamental life force that gives birth to all things. So whether it's people or your pet cat or dog or the trees or the clouds, that force is animating the entire universe, or what we call Buddhaverse, sometimes in the Buddhist tradition.
And of course, it's a very kind of practical day-to-day experience. I think we usually think of a spiritual experience in yoga as, maybe someone could see the chakras or feel the chakras, which of course really very, very rarely happens, if at all. But if you think about just the regular yoga practice where you go in, you feel tired, you feel rotten, you're overwhelmed with all your problems, and then you go out, you feel energized. The problems that were like big mountains are now like small ant hills. And so that transformation really is an infusion of life energy, life force. But we don't necessarily think of it as a spiritual, thing. But that is what was the aim of yoga, according to the ancient yogis, the infusion of life force energy. Is that correct to say?
I think so. And it's not only in the body and specifically the spine, but really it's in the mind. So thoughts have impact on our structure and other people and circumstances that arise. So one at some point has to work with their moods, their attitudes, their held opinions and temperament. And when one kind of tills the soil of the mind-heart, or what in Tibetan is called bodhicitta, then one makes a real fertile ground to be in the world in a positive way. And that does require a kind of intention. We call it always in the Mahayana tradition, the sword that has to cut through confusion and delusion. And so the subtle body is supported, our breath and our heart and our brain waves. And when the negative thinking comes in, it can really be corrosive to one's overall well-being, never mind the people who live nearby us, the people we love the most, are oftentimes, the subject of our grumpiness or our moodiness or our confusion.
Yeah, and then having that source of inner renewal where we can kind of snap out of that sort of like putting on a pair of different glasses. So instead of seeing the world with sunglasses, we see them with bright eyes. That's just such a gift that I think is, one of the unique things about yoga that we may not even necessarily appreciate as a spiritual practice, but in the sense of spirituality as a source of self-development, it very much is.
That's right. I mean, I think if there's anything spiritual in the body, it's the very life force that we have, and that comes into the breath, and it's in the organ of the liver and the kidneys, and it's through the fascia and the spine. And so when we have a kind of reverence to that, or at least a real appreciation for it, we don't want to burn it or smoke it up or drink it, or we really want to, in a sense, hone it, like we're learning to play archery and shoot an arrow. We really want to hone it so that in this lifetime we can experience a feeling of interconnectedness to all. So we can see ourselves as less isolated, less alone, less separate. So we talk a lot about fascia, and I know you've done some beautiful courses on YogaU on fascia, and the fascia around the spine is so important. But fascia is an interweb of being, and when we realize that we're interconnected to everything, what Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing, then we aren't so isolated, but are part of the fabric of everything. And that's a real great vision that can come through yoga training.
Right, indeed. When it comes to working with the life force in yoga, the ancient yogis particularly placed emphasis on the spine. And they viewed the spine as a spiritual channel through which the power of prana flows. And you have said that all of Hatha Yoga really aims to amplify this flow of prana or life force. Could you talk about that and what you mean by that, and how, what is it about yoga practices that does that?
Well, the central nervous system is housed, of course, right in the vertebral column. So you could say all Hatha Yoga is about getting into that pathway through the spinal column up into the brainstem, which is the limbic system, the old reptilian brain, and then into the brain itself, which of course is described as 1,000-petaled lotus in the chakra system. So really that spinal energy is really the conduit for our life force. And without that flow, the peripheral nerves suffer. So the knees or ankles, lower back, or the liver, gallbladder, the organs suffer. So when we awaken the central channel or make it more luminous and bright, there is a feeling of really lightness, kind of like a chimney flue where the air rises in a column. So it's a really beneficent feeling. It's spacious, it's sublime when we connect to it. But the central channel, like a tree or a fern or a milkweed pod, has a central stalk, and that's where its juice is, its deep life force. And sustaining that is a real way of allowing for longevity in the yoga practice.
It's very interesting. You said that when the flow of life force through the spine, or we could call it the flow of nerve energy, is hampered, it impacts the peripheral nervous system and the function of the peripheral nervous system, which of course deals, as you said, with movement, mobility, with the health of the organs function. So what would cause that obstruction in the spine?
Well, when one ages, and perhaps you've been with a grandparent or a parent who's a 70, 80-year-old or 90-year-old, where the whole upper back falls backward and becomes really bound and restricted. So a kyphotic curvature is so common, both for men and women as they age, and the head slides forward. So the spine is not on its axis anymore, but topples like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And so we do shoulder stand, or we do fish poses or shoulder openers to really orient the cranium on top of the spine. So most all schools of body work, whether it's the Alexander technique or Rolfing, osteopathy, really agree that the cranium has to rest on top of the spine, just so it's organized and balanced. And when it's not, it affects brain function, and I think it has a tie into dementia and the capacity to sensory, to pick up through the eyes and ears, sensory information as one ages. So keeping the health of the life of the spine is basically keeping the health of the life of the brain.
Interesting. Yeah. And of course, these days of texting, kyphotic curvature and forward head posture is not just the quote unquote privilege of old age. It's getting more and more common.
Really common. And I think it's an exciting time when we're, of course, in such an age of technology, which we don't know yet how it affects the nervous system. But there's a lot of amazing information coming out on the brain. And the yogis were all into the brain. I mean, the heart, of course, and specifically the communion between heart and brain, or what's called in the Buddhist tradition, the wisdom and compassion, come together, weave together. But really the brain is this network of nerves that has an infinite capacity, and that is only tapped, what they say, the 10% in a general a lifetime. So when we utilize, when we move the body and somatically create all this articulation of our body, and when we open up heart, we really can experience greater brain function, for specifically reducing stress, because stress inhibits brainwave flow. So meditation inhibits the long wave or the alpha wave of the brain. So yogis in their samadhis or their yoga nidra were all into the brain.
Interesting. And one of the things I've noticed about your work that I found very interesting was you wrote somewhere that yoga focuses a lot on breathing practices and practice that will calm the nervous system. And from a modern point of view, you say this really is linked to the brainstem, which governs breathing and much more. So what's the significance of that in terms of this integration of yogic practices with the functioning of the brain?
Right. Well, the brain stem, sometimes called the reptilian brain, and linked in the yogic tradition to the lizard or the serpent or the fish, the really ancient structure that, you know, governs respiration, heart rate, body temperature, sex drive, appetite. And so the brain stem is the essence of the spine, we could say, meaning that it governs all our unconscious activity. So when people don't sleep well, or their digestion goes off, or they have increased heart rate or blood pressure, that all ties back into lower brainstem function, the subcortical structures in the brain. So by connecting to the very ancient rhythms inside of us, breathing, heart rate, digestion, and states of mind and emotions, that we then do connect to brainwave activity, specifically the hindbrain, and so that enables greater harmony or regulation through all the systems of the body.
Right.
So the
Yeah.
brainstem is the junction of the spinal cord and the brain. That's why we do so much practice for the base of the skull, the jaw, the tongue, the inner ears. There's really beautiful instruction on how to relax all these structures, because
Right.
if the brainstem region tightens with the texting of the head forward head thrust, it can impact all the systems of the body.
Interesting. So is the brainstem really responsible for the homeostatic processes in the body, like everything that the body does to maintain equilibrium?
It's really like a computer chip, that's installed deep in the soft tissue of the brain. And so not that we're absolutely hardwired in, but that chip in your center lower brain governs so much of our biological function. Yogis have always been interested in affecting this by perhaps monitoring diet, being a vegetarian or not having sex or not committing violence. There are lots of ways that one can affect brainstem function in order, I think, to create flow and continuity of movement all the way through the spine, which includes open heart, open mind.
Yeah, yeah, it's beautiful. And one of the other things that you have placed emphasis in, this whole unfolding of, spiritual essence, prana, but also the health of our functioning are the eyes. What's the significance of that in terms of the brain functioning and this amplification of the flow of prana in the body?
Of all the sensory organs, the eyes are so dominant. That is, particularly more now than ever, we're such a visual culture, and we're attached to our screens really daily. So the yogis had this intuition that the eyes were so important to work with, right? Which is why we relax the eyes, soften the eyes, and that refers into the occipital lobe, the back brain, because the eyes transit right through what's called the sphenoid bone in the middle of the skull. And this back brain is oftentimes constricted when we get tense, we feel fearful, when we get under stress. There's that kind of fear response, which will really inhibit the blood flow, neurological flow through the vagus nerve and through the brainstem itself. So the yogis, of course, map out this mystical eye that is between the anatomical eyes, and that's thought to be the gateway into the body of light, specifically right into the center of the brain, where it's thought that the analogy of the jewel, or like a droplet, a crystalline droplet of water, is thought to be installed. So in the very center of the brain is this mani, meaning jewel, like Om Mani Padme Hum is the Tibetan phrase for the jewel in the lotus. So through the mystical eye of the center skull, there's attention to the center brain. And it's an old way of connecting to the body of light and referring all the way down the spine to the sacrum and back up the spine through the fluid chamber of the dura. So the two eyes are always picking up outer cues of the world, but the inner eye picks up the inner cues that relate to breath and spirit.
Interesting. And you also said the eyes, the optic nerve, is linked to or closely situated by the pituitary gland, and so you got the hormonal interaction as well.
There's something to be said about that, the link between the optic nerve and hormonal system. They're not directly linked, but in terms of the location in the center of the brain, the master gland that oversees so much of our biological rhythm, the pituitary hypothalamus, is right in the, the chamber of the middle skull where the body of light, to use the old yogic language, is overseen. But we know today as the hormonal system. And so, yeah, I think the eyes relate to our sleep rest patterns or sleep wakeful patterns, and which is why researchers agree today that one shouldn't look at their screen right up to bedtime. You have to shut down your screen, an hour before sleep, this kind of thing. So the eyes are so connected to the endocrine system.
Yeah, yeah.
Through the body of light, because if one suffers from, say, the SADS, seasonal affect disorder, then one would take melatonin pills, and the pineal gland at the back brain, which is kind of the sister gland to the pituitary, oversees light. So, of course, we live in New Mexico where there's light 360 days of the year, but for people who don't get sufficient light, it affects their mood and their attitude and disposition.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, in yoga, the technique for working with the eyes is Drishti, or one of the techniques. So how does Drishti work in terms of, facilitating this connection with the health of the spine and the flow of prana in the body?
I think that Drishti, which is like the gazing, the inner gaze, is so important primarily in softening the eyes, and not only the eyes itself, but the tissue around the eyes. So the forehead skin, the bridge of the nose, and then referring back through the side skull to the back skull. So if you think of like a raccoon, or there's like a band from the eyes all the way to the back skull, and fascially and neurologically all linked. So sometimes I also use the image of Saturn, the rings around Saturn. So there's the eye ring is related, correlates all the way through the skull. So softening this band through the middle cranium, it is important in stress reducing and supporting sleep and states of rest, and the slow wave, long wave pattern of the breath.
Yeah.
So the drishti is mostly softening the eyes, but one can also focus the eyes in concentration practice. So when the eyes are flitting all over like a sparrow, then the concentration can be really scattered.
Right. Very interesting. Great. And everyone listening in will be taking questions for Tias in just a minute. So if you have any questions, be sure to type them into the comments section. And Tias, the last question I have for you is, you have a course on YogaUOnline on this topic of the spine as this, sacred channel for the flow of prana, focusing on yogic practices to amplify this flow of prana. Could you talk about the course and what you're covering?
Yes, in this course we talk a lot about the spine as a channel for light, and not only sun but moonlight, or in the ancient lore it's the starlight as well. So when one connects to the body of light, it does give a sense of spaciousness and loft for the overall prana inside. And the vertebral column has 72 joints in total when we consider all the interlocking pieces. And so when the spinal column is aligned, the inner neurological flow is moves without inhibition. And that allows for really clear states of awareness and sitting meditation, clarity, which is valuable for touching into the feeling of sublime or spaciousness. And so in this course, we look at the body of light, again, how to align the vertebral column and to bring all of the neural pathways through the body into a central channel that brings a kind of sense of holism or integration from the toenail to the inner ear and all the way through. So that can be felt if one really attunes to the total pulsatory murmur or electrical flow through all the tissues, and specifically through the spine. I think over time one can really sense their very fine spinal motion, and it's quite delightful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think, I mean, both in terms, no matter what your orientation is, whether you want spiritual enlightenment or you just want to age, you know, in a more gradual way and prevent dementia and keep your brain sharp and functioning. What I love about what you're offering are these very, very subtle techniques that really enable us to go right in there and get a better sense of, you know, the movement of the cranial sacral fluid, you know, working, you know, with softening, relaxing the eyes, working with, you know, connecting with brainstem functioning. And I think it's a real treasure that you're offering there. So thank you so much for that.
Sure. And I think they're practices people can do before they sleep or before a meeting or right before dinner or obviously in a meditation or shavasana. Just
Right.
little cues to, okay, say, let go of the holding, the gripping, the tension. And that can trigger little micro releases throughout the entire body. So
Yeah.
working with the jaw, the inner ear, the eyes, the brainstem. I think just through a bit of practice, that can ripple out through the body and allow for great ease and as a de-stressor.
Right, right. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Mm.
Let's see, we have a couple of comments here. So Robin McMahon says, thank you for your practice and for sharing what you know so beautifully. Beth or Sheila is saying, thank you, Tias, for your wisdom teaching always. Sheila Rinsel. And then we got a couple of questions. Beth Beery is asking, what do you value about the chakra or meridian system teachings?
Oh, that's a very good question.
We should have started with that question.
Well, the Chinese system has a central channel as well. Actually, there are two of them, one along the anterior and one in the posterior, and they loop from the base to the crown. So when one starts to track the flow of nerve and blood and prana through the central spine, one can work with these Chinese meridians, partly what's called the orbiting, cosmic orbit, up the back and down the front. And those are great meditations from Qigong practice. So like the Indian system, they may have been, you know, texting each other back and forth in the, you know, 4th, 5th centuries to discuss the map of the internal body. But the Chinese, like the Indian system, maps a central channel. The Greeks had a similar idea. They called the spinal cord the holy marrow, or the holy tube through which the sacred marrow flows. So there's this idea in the spiritual sciences and in Western medicine going back to its root of this sacred channel. And the chakras are located along this channel, and like a prism, light comes through the body of the head, top of the head, and refracts into all these different color patterns that manifest as the chakras.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Let's see, Carol is saying Parkinson's disease has been associated to dormant cells in the substantia nigra of the hindbrain. So how can we wake them up?
Working with the peripheral nervous system is most important. So for any kind of neurological challenge like MS or Parkinson's, or whether there's been paralysis, generally extending out through the feet and the toes and the inner knees, hands, arms, wrists, you open up the peripheral nervous system to introduce the sensory feedback loop, sensory motor feedback loop back to the brainstem is really important. So we work more globally in order to refer back centrally to the spinal cord and brainstem.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was just watching a little boy yesterday who is developmentally challenged. Don't know if it's autism or whatever. But it was interesting. He was like 5 or 6 years old, but he was moving like a 2 or 3 year old. And it just seemed like, you know, that disconnect between the peripheral and the central nervous system was a big factor in terms of the limitations, whether, you know, you're struggling with Parkinson's or MS, or in this case, developmental delay.
There can be a real schism or break between the periphery and headquarters in the center. So bridging that divide is so important. Thomas Hanna, a founder of somatics, he identified this kind of thing as sensory motor amnesia, where the sensory feedback loop just gets broken or thwarted or blocked. So through movement, we reestablish that circuitry, which builds greater proprioceptive awareness and orientation in space.
Yeah, it's very, I think we have no idea just how powerful it is to simple, not just rote movement, but really conscious, mindful awareness that increases interoception, proprioception, and really rewires the brain for more subtle levels of movement and experience.
I think there has to be brain rewiring every day for 45 minutes to an hour, especially as we age. We need to practice longer. Otherwise, the nerve tissue will shrink and become dehydrated or blocked. So every day, brain rewiring.
Yeah, very good point. All right, let me see if I can find one last question here. See here. I lost my questions. Catherine is asking, do you have any practices helpful to autonomic dysfunction?
Well, again, I think very small somatic movements like raising the shoulder and then dropping it, or raising the shoulder and moving the ear towards the shoulder, help to re-establish the flow of nerve and the circulatory flow through the tissues, blood and lymph. So the autonomic nervous system is all brainstem function. So by movement, breathing, and meditative awareness, we can affect the autonomic nervous system. It takes a little time. And people, of course, can take pharmaceuticals, and that can have a very fast effect on digestion or breathing. But we look to do it with movements and working with our own biology. So autonomic function can be changed over time. Well, again, working with the arms and the legs, referring back to spinal column is really important.
Yeah, wonderful. Last question is from Anne Goldstein. She says, I fractured my cervical spine several years ago. Is there any hope? Small subluxation, non-surgical, but painful. Any hope?
Sure. I think we work with the local soft tissues around the area of trauma. And the body is so adaptable and responsive that local tissue around the area of trauma will pick up the slack and become more intelligent and responsive. So over time, the area where there's been compression or fracture can reset, and the pain levels can go down. But it's really important to work, say, with the pectoral region or the shoulder or the upper trapezius to be able to induce greater flow, metabolic supply to the tissue. And so when there's trauma in any area of the body, we work more globally rather than just locally.
Right.
I mean, I injured my forearm last year, and I was really working from my lower back and sacrum to heal my forearm. So act globally, and
think
in order to
locally.
support locally. Yeah.
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 Yeah, it brings up a good point because certainly for something that's a little more severe, like cervical fracture, you do want to work with either a PT or an experienced yoga teacher. But there are things on the global level of the body that will also work. I think increasing range of motion in any part of the body will help restore integration. But would you work more like on the level of the arms, or would you also in that case work like, as you said, with the whole body?
The arms, yeah, the arms are conduits into the neck, and all the cervical nerves pass through the shoulder into the arm. So you're working with the wrists, forearms, bicep area, in this case, to address cervical strain. So the problem is when people get injured or they have body pain is they just shrink wrap and say, oh no, I better not move at all. And so one may have to, of course, keep the area of trauma stable, but there's lots of other movement that can occur. So then there's a dance, like up with the area of strain and what the pain is like, and can I start irrigating blood and circulation into the tissue to be able to heal, because blood is the healer. So increasing circulatory flow in a safe way is really important.
Right. Yeah. And this whole concept of feathering, where you don't go directly into the area that has an issue, but you can sort of tiptoe around it, feathering by sensing, when you're getting close to the pain threshold and staying away from that, but still working within that general area. That's usually a wonderful, wonderful way to work with it.
And just very feather fine movements, what I call nuance movement, can be very powerful. There's lots of research that shows that small movements will open large aspects of the brain or square footage within the brain. So just do very micro, small movements to heal.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Wonderful. T.S., we kept you a long time, and I really want to say how much we appreciate your time. And we got lots. I only read a couple of comments of people saying thank you for joining us, but there were lots of those comments. People really appreciate it. You taking the time to share with us of your incredible deep wisdom. Usually we think about your wisdom as being about yogic philosophy and subtle body yoga, but you also have this incredible integration with very, very deep knowledge of Western anatomy as it relates to those practices, and that's what's just so important about your teaching. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's a joy to be with you, Eva, and thank you, everyone. Happy practice.
Yes, and thanks for joining us, everyone. Yes, we look very much forward to your course. Take care.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.